Hinduism is one of the oldest religions in the world. And when the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama was his family name, when he was born and he grew up, he was very heavily influenced by Hinduism. He grew up on the border of India and Nepal, and I actually had the opportunity while I was over in those countries to visit his birthplace, where he was born in his palace, which now isn't so much of a palace. It's quite the opposite, actually. But the actual spot that he was born, I did some meditation there, and he understood what his heart was calling him to do. What his heart wanted him to do was find the nature of all suffering and how to be released from it. So after he had tried a lot of different methods to get to the root cause of what suffering was and how to release yourself from it, he had learned a lot from many teachers along the way. And then one day he sat underneath, some people call it a fig tree, some people call it a body tree, and he went into meditation. And the story goes that he meditated for a long time, and he went through many tests. And as he went through these tests, he was tested by all the earthly desires, the cravings, the attachments, everything that you could think of that would test a person, and he basically let them go. He was not attached to them. And at that point, he experienced nirvana, enlightenment. And he became known as the Buddha. And then his first sermon, which was a few weeks later, was in a place called Sarnath, Deer Park, which is not too far from Varanasi in India. And I visited this place. I was able to spend the day at Sarnath in Deer Park. And it was kind of neat being in the place where he gave his first sermon. There's a really neat energy there, knowing that this is the first sermon Buddha ever gave, right here. And it's interesting because there is deer in the park. I guess that's why it's called Deer Park. What he taught at Deer Park were the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And this was a raft. This was meant to be a raft through life. It's not meant to be the end-all to the end-alls of alls to find your spiritual calling or to find nirvana. But what it's meant to put your mind in a certain state, to be ready to open your mind to the possibility of enlightenment. When the Buddha discovered that, he went and he started basically telling as many people as he could for many years. He lived he lived until he was 80 years old. Okay. At that point, when he died, people became very interested in what he said, and Buddhism was starting to flourish in northern India and starting to move into India. Also, it was starting to spread to places like Sri Lanka, okay, and into other places as well. Now what happened is Buddhism divided. About 100 years after Buddha died, it divided into two main sectors of Buddhism. One was called the Theravada, okay, which is, they call it the small circle of Buddhism. And what it is people who follow what they call a Pali Canon, which is the doctrines that were collected when Buddha died and many years later put down, and they follow it to a T, which means they believe, small circle Buddhism or Theravada, Buddhism believes that their particular path is to be renounced from everything. That means family life, everything from society. It's basically meditative. You go in, you seclude yourself, and you become liberated. There was another path that developed, which is called Mahayana. And that path was called large circle because it included everyday life. You could get married, you could have children, you could do everything you do, but you follow the ways of the Buddha in your everyday life, or the message. Zen Buddhism comes from Mahayana Buddhism. So what happened is, two distinct forms of Buddhism developed out of Mahayana. One was the Tibetan Buddhism, which everybody's familiar with today, because of the Dalai Lama, which I had the opportunity and the pleasure to meet him on my trip. Okay? And it developed in Tibet, out of Mahayana Buddhism. And Zen went through China. One of the most famous people to bring it into China was a gentleman by the name of Bodhidharma. Now, Bodhidharma is famous to the martial arts because the story goes, what he did is he came to China from India. He was Indian. And his slant on Buddhism was different. He believed that you could read all the scriptures you wanted to. You could read everything about Buddhism that the Buddha put down you wanted to, but unless you had a direct experience, you didn't understand what enlightenment was. You had to have a direct experience with it. You couldn't just read it, because reading it was not the truth. That was just somebody else's truth they wrote down. And because words were limited, you'd never get the full truth from it. And I'm going to get into that a little later in the discussion. Okay? So, what happened is he brought this way, and his way was meditation. Okay? In India, it was called dhyana. And as it came into China, it became known as Chan. And in Japan, when it moved from China to Japan, it became known as Zen. And see, everybody would always get down on their hands and knees and beg the emperor for attention, because he's a very powerful man. But Bodhidharma would never do that. He didn't care about the emperor's attention. So he went and he told him the truth. He said, da 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 da. The emperor said, no, no, no. He said, you're not answering my questions the way I want them to be answered. He says, it's because your answers aren't the answers. So the emperor kicked him out. Didn't want to kill him because Bodhidharma told him sort of this thing about karma. And he said, well, I don't think I'll kill you because, I don't know, maybe you're telling me something that's sort of truthful, and maybe not, but I don't want to take a chance on it. So just get out of my palace. So he wandered on, and he came across the Shaolin Temple. And as Bodhidharma went to the temple, he says, okay, well, you know, for my exchange of being here, he says, let me teach your monks meditation. Now, at this time, the Shaolin Temple wasn't really notorious for martial arts. They were practicing some you know, little things, but nothing to the degree of what it became. It was really basic. A little bit of exercising here and there, but not much. And mostly, the monks were very undisciplined. So as he taught them the 18 hands of Lohan, he was able to see what their discipline was. He was able to see, could they concentrate? Could they focus? Could they follow instructions? And he was helping them to develop these things through the physical body. Because the physical body, you can manifest these principles. Right? The body, if you say, okay, I want you to concentrate, and as you take your hand and you strike, you know, like a tiger, as an example, and put it here, well, if the monk goes over here, then he's not really able to follow instructions. So Bodhidharma would come by and say, hey, I said here, put your hand here. Oh, okay, all right. And they help to fine-tune those intangible principles. Because when we're sitting in meditation, it's very hard to teach somebody awareness, because it's intangible. But through the body, you can develop awareness by looking and seeing that these things are actually being done. Right? If you're supposed to go here, and your hand is over here, how much awareness is that? And he started teaching them the aspects of meditation. This is when it became known as Chan. Bodhidharma is known as the first patriarch of Zen Buddhism. He is the father. He's known as the father of Zen Buddhism. It started at that point, as the story goes, in Shaolin Temple. What is Zen then? Well, Zen is the ability to transcend all teachings, to transcend everything that you think you know and get to a point beyond that. Because in Zen philosophy, if you think you know the right way, or if you think you know the truth, then it isn't the way. And that's very typical of Taoism. That's where the Taoism philosophy comes in. Okay? It has to be experienced directly. And that's what Zen philosophy is all about. It's about that meditative essence of experiencing the truth directly. Because that's all it can be experienced by. You can't read it in a particular book and say, I know the truth. Because that's not the real truth in Zen philosophy. There are two schools of Zen philosophy in Japan. Just like Buddhism broke away from India and went into Theravada, Mahayana, and then broke into Tibetan Buddhism and Zen Buddhism, or sorry, Chan in China and then Zen in Japan. In Japan, it broke again into two ways. There was the school of Soto and the school of Renzai, Zen. The only difference between the two of them is one school believes in gradual enlightenment, which means day by day you practice the Buddhist ways and you become enlightened. And the other school, Renzai, believes in sudden enlightenment, which means you can go into meditation and you can use like a koan, which is an illogical sentence to sort of make you go beyond the ways that you think, take you above the ways that you think, and you can have a direct experience with the truth. Instantly. You know the Sufis? The Sufis are a mystical branch of Muslims that they also believe truth can only be experienced directly. So they're sort of parallel with the Zen philosophy, but they have their own methods of achieving it. One of their methods is whirling. You know what whirling is? Yeah, exactly. Okay? Just basically where you're whirling. And they do it for hours on hours on hours on hours and hours and hours and hours. I think it's something like the record is 30 or 40 or something like hours, where they just whirl. And they believe that they're shedding off all conditioning and shedding off everything that is of Maya, or the illusion that it's not really true. It's, you don't need it. And as you shed it off, you get to your original nature. It's like peeling away an onion. You peel away an onion until you get to the really root core. Karma is a very interesting concept. I'll tell you a little analogy or a story that the Buddhists talk about. They say, there's this thief who's trying to break into this palace. As he's breaking into this palace, he steps in the window, and the window breaks, and he breaks his leg. So, he sues the owner of the palace for breaking his leg, right? So the owner says, well, it's not my fault. He says, it's the carpenter's fault, because he installed the window incorrectly. And the carpenter says, well, it's not my fault. He says, it's the mason's fault for putting in the structure of the window incorrectly. And the mason says, what? It's not my fault. He says, well, I was putting in the window. He says, this beautiful lady walked by. She was beautiful. Caught my attention. And So the judge says, well, let me talk to the beautiful lady. The beautiful lady says, well, it's not my fault. He says, this day, I had just gotten this new veil. And this veil was rainbow color. I've never looked so beautiful in my life. Everybody was looking at me. The judge says, okay. All right. He says, who dyed it? Who dyed the color, the rainbow color? So that when it gets to the root of the story, it was her husband who dyed it. But it was also her husband who was the thief that was breaking into the palace. Okay? So that little story gives you an idea of what karma is all about and how it comes back to you. A true teacher will give you a resource, a tool, so that you yourself can discover it yourself. But won't try to plant in your mind what it is. Because if you hear what it is, that's all you're doing is you're hearing it. And it's not necessarily what it is. It's something that you've heard. When you experience it, you'll know for sure. There will be no doubt in your mind. Okay? So if you hear about this, or you see that right now, I can go through every one of you here, and I bet you have a different answer if I actually describe what that is on the floor. You say, oh, I get all, oh, black, this, that, this has got buttons on it. I mean, there will be different answers from all of you. Because you're looking at it from a distance. And that's the same thing with teachings. When you read a teaching, it's multi-interpretable. Like you pull out the I Ching. When the I Ching is a book that we use quite a bit here in the studio. It's multi-interpretable. You pull out the Bible, you pull out the Quran, you pull out the Pitakas, Tikas from the Buddhist faith. And they're all multi-interpretable. Okay? But when you hit that point of that light that burns without wick or oil, the enlightenment, the nirvana, the mushka, there's no more distance from this. It's as if you are that looking from outside. So you don't have to describe it from a distance because you are it. And this is where I believe all the scriptures came from. People who had the enlightenment experience and then sat down afterwards and started writing about it. Or their followers wrote about it years later. But because we live in a world of polarities and we live in a world of limitation, when you try to explain what it is, it only comes through as a part truth. It's like, okay, here's the water, right? And the mountain's up there, but you're looking at the reflection of the mountain in the water. But it's not the mountain, it's just a reflection. And when you read something, you're getting the reflection. And you're going, yeah, wow, yeah. But it's not necessarily what it is, you're getting the reflection of what it is. So what Zen Buddhism is attempting to do is give you the tools to directly experience that mountain yourself. So that you don't have to see it from a secondary source. You are